When he heard the flower seller sing, the millionaire froze upon recognizing the song. The same one his wife used to play before she disappeared 21 years ago. Thomas Caldwell adjusted his Italian silk tie as he exited the gleaming skyscraper that housed the headquarters of Caldwell Enterprises. Another successful board meeting. Another billion-dollar deal closed. At 48, he had expanded his family's real estate empire beyond what even his ambitious father could have imagined. From the outside, he had it all. Power, wealth, respect. Yet as the afternoon sun hit his face, the familiar emptiness settled in his chest. 25 years. Today marked exactly 25 years since Abigail vanished. He dismissed his waiting driver with a wave. "I'll walk, James. Need some air." The May afternoon was unusually warm for New York. The kind of day that made Central Park burst with life. Business people on lunch breaks, tourists with their cameras, children being shepherded by watchful nannies. Thomas walked among them like a ghost, present but separate. His mind drifting back to another spring day when he was 23 and the world still made sense. He had been thrust into running the family business after his parents' plane crashed into the Atlantic. And then he met Abigail, bright-eyed, warm, with talent that made the piano keys dance under her fingers. She came from nothing, worked as a music teacher in a public school, lived in a tiny Brooklyn apartment. His world had shifted on its axis the moment she smiled at him across that crowded charity gala. "Mr. Caldwell." His assistant's voice broke through the memory. Thomas realized he'd been standing motionless on the sidewalk, staring at nothing. "I'm fine, Rebecca," he said, answering his phone. "Just taking a walk." Margaret called. "She wants to review the anniversary gala preparations." Thomas suppressed a sigh. "Tell her I'll be back by 4. His sister had been even more controlling than usual lately, obsessing over every detail of the upcoming 25th anniversary celebration of Caldwell Enterprises. To the public, Margaret Blake was the devoted CFO who had helped her younger brother build the company after tragedy struck. Only Thomas knew the constant power struggles that occurred behind closed doors. He cut through Central Park, taking the familiar path he'd walked hundreds of times. It was a route that hadn't changed in 25 years. Unlike everything else in his life, the afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the path. That's when he heard it. A melody, soft and haunting, drifting through the air like a ghost. Thomas froze, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. It couldn't be. It was impossible. He followed the sound, moving as if in a trance. Around a bend in the path stood a small flower cart, bursting with colorful blooms. Behind it, a young woman arranged tulips while humming a tune that had haunted Thomas's dreams for 25 years. Alma Perdida, the lost soul, the song Abigail had composed for him alone, that she played on their piano every night before bed, a song she had never recorded, never shared with anyone else. Their private melody, their secret language of love. The young woman looked up, startled by his sudden appearance. She was perhaps 24, with chestnut hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, and eyes that reflected the afternoon sunlight. But it was the small birthmark on her right temple, shaped like a crescent moon, that sent ice through Thomas's veins, identical to Abigail's. "Can I help you with something?" the woman asked, her voice pleasant, tinged with concern at his obvious shock. Thomas struggled to find his voice. "That song. Where did you learn it?" She tilted her head, the gesture so achingly familiar that Thomas had to grip the edge of the flower cart to steady himself. "Oh, was I humming again? Sorry, it's an old habit." She smiled apologetically. "My mother taught it to me. Well, my adoptive mother said it was important, though she never really explained why." "What's your name?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Avery," she replied. "Avery Miller." Somewhere in the back of his mind, Thomas registered that people were staring at the well-dressed businessman who looked like he'd seen a ghost, in a way. "I'm sorry," he managed. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Her smile was polite but confused. "No problem. Would you like to buy some flowers? The peonies just came in fresh this morning." Thomas nodded mechanically, pulling out his wallet. As she wrapped a bouquet, he surreptitiously studied her features. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her cheekbones, the way she bit her lower lip as she concentrated. All Abigail. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, handing him the flowers. "Yes, thank you." He forced himself to walk away, fighting the urge to turn back, to demand answers to questions he couldn't articulate. Once out of sight, he pulled out his phone with trembling hands and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Blackwood Investigations. Jack, it's Thomas Caldwell. I need your services again. Immediately. Mr. Caldwell, it's been a while. I need everything you can find on a woman named Avery Miller. She sells flowers in Central Park, early 20s, brown hair. Start with adoption records. He paused, his throat tight. And Jack, complete discretion is essential. No one can know about this, especially not my sister. As he disconnected the call, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 25 years, the faintest flicker of hope. In her corner office 53 floors above Manhattan, Margaret Blake stared at the surveillance photo that had just been sent to her phone. Her brother, looking shell-shocked, standing at a flower cart in Central Park. "Everything all right, Mrs. Blake?" Logan Peterson, her head of security, asked from the doorway. Margaret zoomed in on the image, focusing on the young flower seller. Something about her seemed oddly familiar. "Logan, I need you to find out who this girl is immediately. May I ask why?" Margaret's perfectly manicured nail tapped against the screen. "Because my brother doesn't stop to buy flowers from street vendors. And he certainly doesn't look at them like he's seen a ghost." As Logan left, Margaret turned to the window, gazing out at the empire she'd helped build and protect. For 25 years, she thought of the letter she'd drafted for Abigail to leave behind, the arrangements she'd made, the loose ends she'd tied up. "Perdoe-me, meu amor, mas não posso continuar. Esta é a única forma de proteger o que mais amamos." She'd made Abigail memorize those Portuguese words. "Forgive me, my love, but I cannot continue. This is the only way to protect what we love most." Knowing Thomas would recognize his wife's handwriting, but never question the authenticity of the note. Margaret had believed that particular chapter of their lives was closed forever, but something in her brother's expression in that photo made her uneasy. Some melodies, it seemed, refused to stay buried. Avery Miller wiped the condensation from the tiny bathroom mirror in her studio apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop in the East Village. Her morning ritual never varied. Shower, coffee, arrange her hair in a practical ponytail, all while humming Alma Perdida, the melody that had been her lullaby, her comfort, her constant companion for as long as she could remember. The apartment was modest but cozy, filled with potted plants and secondhand furniture she'd lovingly restored. Vintage photographs lined the walls, mostly of Geraldine, the woman who had raised her as her own in Savannah. Now, at 78, Geraldine resided in a nursing home in Queens, her mind increasingly clouded by age. Avery poured coffee into a chipped mug that read, "World's Best Mom," a Mother's Day gift she'd given Geraldine years ago. As she sipped, her thoughts drifted to the strange man from yesterday. There had been something unsettling in the way he'd looked at her, almost as if he knew her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Delivery from Flower Market arrived early. Need help sorting." "Be down in 10, Avery replied, pushing away the lingering unease. She glanced at her calendar where a red circle marked this Sunday, her weekly visit to Sunny Gardens Assisted Living, despite Geraldine's increasingly frequent confusion. Those visits remained the anchor of Avery's week. Maybe today she'll remember more, Avery whispered to herself, touching the faded sheet music framed on her wall, the original copy of Alma Perdida that Geraldine had insisted was her birthright, though she would never explain why, across town. In his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, Thomas Caldwell hadn't slept. He'd spent the night poring over old photo albums, the ones he usually kept locked away, photos of Abigail smiling on their honeymoon in Santorini, Abigail at the piano, her fingers a blur over the keys, Abigail with that same crescent-shaped birthmark visible on her temple. His phone rang at precisely 7 a.m. "Jack, tell me you have something. Preliminary information only," the investigator replied. "Avery Miller, 24 years old, born in Savannah, Georgia, adopted shortly after birth by Geraldine Miller, a single woman in her 50s at the time. Mother's name on the birth certificate is listed as Jane Doe, died in childbirth. No father listed." Thomas gripped the phone tighter. "Geraldine Miller. Where is she now?" "Sunny Gardens Assisted Living in Queens. Early stages of dementia according to her medical records. And before Savannah, Any connection to New York, to my family? A pause. That's where it gets interesting. Geraldine Miller worked as a housekeeper for the Caldwell family from 1978 to 1999. Thomas closed his eyes, memories flooding back. Mrs. Miller, the kind-hearted housekeeper who had practically raised him after his mother became increasingly involved in social obligations. The woman who had served Abigail tea during her first nervous visit to the Caldwell mansion. She left our employment right after Abigail disappeared, Thomas said quietly. Records show she relocated to Savannah in June 1999, 1 month after your wife's disappearance. Adopted Avery in September of that same year. The timing fits, Thomas whispered, more to himself than to Jack. I need everything you can find on Avery's adoption. And I want to know where Geraldine Miller was during the month between leaving New York and showing up in Savannah. I'm on it. One more thing, Mr. Caldwell. The flower cart is licensed to Chen's Florals in the East Village. Avery Miller lives in an apartment above the shop. After hanging up, Thomas walked to the window, watching the morning light glint off the river. 25 years of emptiness, of questioned memories, of wondering if he could have done more to find Abigail. And now this. A young woman with Abigail's birthmark, humming Abigail's song, whose adoptive mother had worked in their home. It couldn't be coincidence, yet he feared allowing himself to hope. In her executive suite at Caldwell Tower, Margaret paced in front of floor-to-ceiling windows, iPhone pressed to her ear. I need more than a name, Logan, she snapped. I need to know why my brother is interested in her. Logan Peterson sat in his parked Audi across from Chen's Florals, watching as Avery helped an elderly man select roses. Avery Miller, he reported, works at a flower shop in the East Village, lives above it, 24 years old. Margaret froze. 24? Yes, adopted as an infant in Georgia. Her adoptive mother is Geraldine Miller, Margaret finished, her voice suddenly flat. How did you know? Get back to the office now. Margaret ended the call and sank into her chair. 24 years. The timing couldn't be more damning if Abigail had been pregnant when she disappeared. Margaret unlocked her private safe and removed a thick folder labeled AB 1999. Inside were surveillance photos of Abigail in the weeks before her disappearance, including one of her leaving a doctor's office, hand resting unconsciously on her stomach. Damn you, Geraldine, Margaret whispered. All these years, she'd believed her secret was safe, that the documents Abigail had discovered were destroyed, that the loose ends were tied up. She'd underestimated the old housekeeper's loyalty. And now, just as Caldwell Enterprises approached its most important milestone, the past threatened to unravel everything she'd built. Her intercom buzzed. Ms. Blake, the anniversary gala committee is waiting in conference room A. Margaret took a deep breath, smoothed her Chanel suit, and tucked the folder back into the safe. She had an empire to protect. Avery's flower cart was busy that afternoon. Spring always brought good business, with tourists eager for fresh blooms to brighten their hotel rooms, and locals celebrating the end of another New York winter, as she wrapped lilies for a young man clearly buying an apology bouquet. Avery found herself scanning the park path. Part of her expected the strange man from yesterday to return. There had been something in his eyes, pain, recognition, disbelief, that had haunted her dreams. Avery Miller. She turned to find a different man standing before her. Tall, athletic build, expensive suit that couldn't quite hide his military bearing. His smile was professional, but his eyes were assessing. Yes, James Logan, Caldwell Securities. He handed her a business card. Our CEO was quite impressed with your flowers yesterday. We're planning a large corporate event and would like to discuss having you provide the arrangements. Caldwell. The name triggered a vague memory. As in Caldwell Enterprises. The very same. Perhaps we could meet for coffee to discuss the details. Avery studied the card. Something felt off about this sudden interest from a major corporation. Your boss could have just called the shop, she said carefully. We do corporate events all the time. Logan's smile never wavered. Mr. Caldwell appreciates the personal touch. Shall we say tomorrow around noon? I'll need to check with my boss, Avery replied. Why don't you leave your number and I'll call you? As Logan walked away, Avery felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. She slipped the business card into her pocket, making a mental note to look up Caldwell Enterprises when she got home. Something told her the strange encounter in the park yesterday and this sudden business interest were connected, and somehow, inexplicably, she felt like they were both tied to the melody she couldn't stop humming, the song that had followed her from birth, the music sheet Geraldine had framed and called her true inheritance. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Central Park, two worlds that had been carefully kept apart for 24 years were slowly, inevitably beginning to collide. The manila folder landed on Thomas's desk with a soft thud. Jack Blackwood, silver-haired and perpetually rumpled despite his expensive suit, settled into the chair opposite Thomas's desk. "Everything I could find on Avery Miller," he said. "Birth records, adoption papers, school transcripts, employment history. Not much there to raise flags. Straight A student. Music scholarship she turned down to care for her adoptive mother. Clean record, but it's what's missing that's interesting." Thomas flipped through the documents, scanning for anything that might connect this young woman to Abigail, beyond the uncanny resemblance and the melody. "No father listed on the birth certificate," Jack continued. "Mother recorded as Jane Doe, who allegedly died in childbirth at Savannah Memorial. Except I checked their records. No Jane Doe matching that description died there in 1999. No unidentified women died in childbirth in any Georgia hospital that year." Thomas looked up sharply. "You're saying the birth records were falsified?" "Expertly," Jack nodded. "And there's more. Geraldine Miller left your family's employment on May 20th, 1999, exactly 2 weeks after your wife disappeared, surfaced in Savannah on June 18th, almost a month unaccounted for. And Avery, first official record, is the adoption filing on September 3rd, 1999, birth date listed as August 15th. 1999. Thomas did the mental calculation. If Abigail had been pregnant when she disappeared in early May, that would make sense if... He couldn't bring himself to complete the thought aloud. Jack nodded, understanding. "I also looked into Geraldine's background before working for your family. She was a midwife in rural Pennsylvania. She would have had the knowledge to deliver a baby without hospital assistance." Thomas rose and walked to the window. New York sprawled before him, a city of 8 million secrets. For 25 years, he'd searched for answers about Abigail's disappearance, hired the best investigators, followed every lead. "Why wouldn't she have come to me?" he whispered. "If Abigail was pregnant, why run? Why let me believe she'd left me?" Jack cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. I pulled Geraldine's phone records every Sunday for the past 24 years. She's received a call from a burner phone. The call stopped 6 months ago, right when she was admitted to Sunny Gardens with early-stage dementia." Thomas turned. "Someone's been checking on her, making sure the secret stays buried. That would be my guess." "I need to speak with Geraldine." Jack shook his head. "You might want to move quickly. According to her medical records, her cognitive decline has accelerated in recent months. Sunny Gardens assisted living facility looked more like a small college campus than a nursing home. Manicured lawns, colonial architecture, discreet security, all designed to ease the discomfort of wealthy New Yorkers placing their parents in care." Thomas approached the reception desk, where a young man in scrubs looked up from his computer. "I'm here to see Geraldine Miller. Are you family?" the receptionist asked. "An old friend." Thomas offered his most disarming smile. "Thomas Caldwell. She worked for my family for many years." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly at the name. "Mrs. Miller is in the garden pavilion. Shall I show you the way?" The garden was peaceful, scattered with residents reading or playing chess. In a quiet corner sat an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her white hair neatly styled, her gnarled hands resting on a blanket despite the warm day. "Mrs. Miller," Thomas said softly as he approached. Geraldine looked up, her expression pleasant but vacant. "Hello, dear. Have you brought my sheet music? I need to practice for Avery's lesson." Thomas sat on the bench beside her wheelchair. "It's Thomas Caldwell." For a moment, nothing changed in her expression. Then a flicker of recognition, followed by something Thomas hadn't expected. Fear. "Thomas." Her voice trembled. "Little Tommy, oh, you've grown so much." "Mrs. Miller, I need to ask you about Abigail." The change was immediate. Geraldine's eyes darted around the garden as if searching for eavesdroppers. Her hands clutched the blanket. "Abigail," she whispered. "She played so beautifully the sonata. She played it every night." "Alma Perdida," Thomas said carefully. "She wrote it for me. Geraldine's eyes suddenly cleared, fixing on Thomas with unexpected clarity. "You've seen her, haven't you? You've found my Avery." Thomas felt his heart rate spike. "Avery is your adopted daughter. But who is she really, Mrs. Miller? Is she Abigail's child? They said they would hurt her," Geraldine whispered, her voice suddenly stronger. "I couldn't let them hurt the baby. I promised Abigail. I promised I'd keep her safe until—" Geraldine's eyes widened suddenly. Her hand flying to her throat, she made a choking sound, her body stiffening. "Nurse!" Thomas shouted, reaching for the emergency call button clipped to Geraldine's blanket. "We need help here." The next few minutes were chaos. Medical staff rushed in, moved Geraldine to a gurney, whisked her away as her body convulsed. Thomas found himself pushed aside, standing helplessly in the garden as residents stared and murmured, "Sir, are you family?" A doctor approached, clipboard in hand. "No, I'm a friend. Is she all right? She appears to be having a stroke. We're transferring her to Mount Sinai. Are you aware of any family we should contact?" "Her daughter," Thomas said automatically. "Avery Miller." As the doctor hurried away, Thomas stood frozen in place. The fear in Geraldine's eyes when she said, "They said they would hurt her," kept replaying in his mind. Who had threatened Abigail? Who had Geraldine been protecting Avery from all these years? Margaret Blake's office door burst open without a knock. Logan entered, his typical composure visibly shaken. "Geraldine Miller just had a stroke. She's being taken to Mount Sinai." Margaret set down her pen carefully. "And this concerns us how, exactly? Your brother was with her when it happened." Margaret's carefully maintained facade cracked for just a moment. "He found her already. How? Unknown. But hospital records show he's listed as the emergency contact for notification." Margaret rose, smoothing her skirt with practiced precision. "Find out what they discussed. And I want to know the moment she regains consciousness. If she regains consciousness." Logan hesitated. "There's one more thing. Thomas Caldwell has requested a DNA test. The lab received samples from both him and Avery Miller this morning." Margaret stared out the window, her reflection in the glass betraying nothing of the calculations happening behind her eyes. 25 years of careful planning, of buried evidence, of paid silence, all potentially undone by a stroke of chance in Central Park. "The 25th anniversary gala is in 2 weeks, she said finally. "Nothing can interfere with that. Nothing. What would you like me to do about Avery Miller?" Margaret turned, her eyes cold. "Keep surveillance on her, but do nothing to raise suspicions. If Thomas is already pursuing a DNA test, we need to be extremely careful." After Logan left, Margaret unlocked a hidden panel in her office wall, revealing a safe. From it, she removed a small flash drive and inserted it into her computer. Photos appeared on the screen. Abigail leaving a doctor's office, Abigail arguing with Margaret in the Caldwell library, Abigail hurriedly packing a bag while looking over her shoulder. The final photo showed a pregnant Abigail sitting beside Geraldine on a bus headed south. "You should have stayed disappeared," Margaret whispered to the image of the frightened young woman who had once been her sister-in-law. "Now your daughter will pay the price of your indiscretion." Avery felt it before she saw it. That peculiar prickle at the back of her neck that signaled she was being watched. She'd been feeling it all day, during her morning deliveries, while restocking the flower cart, and now as she locked up the shop. A quick glance over her shoulder revealed nothing unusual on the quiet East Village street, just the normal evening crowd heading to bars and restaurants. Maybe she was being paranoid. The strange business card from the Caldwell securities man had unsettled her more than she cared to admit after researching Caldwell Enterprises online, a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire run by siblings Thomas and Margaret Caldwell. She'd decided against calling the number. Something felt off about the whole situation. Her phone buzzed as she climbed the stairs to her apartment. Unknown number. "Hello. Is this Avery Miller?" A woman's voice, crisp and professional. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Mount Sinai Hospital. You're listed as the emergency contact for Geraldine Miller. I'm afraid she's been admitted after suffering a stroke." The world tilted sideways. "Is she?" "She's stable but unconscious. The doctors are running tests now. I'll be right there." Avery's hand shook as she gathered her purse and keys. Outside, she hailed a taxi, too distracted to notice the black Audi that pulled away from the curb to follow her. Thomas paced the hospital waiting room, checking his watch for the 10th time. The DNA test results wouldn't be back for days, but in his heart, he already knew the truth. Avery Miller was his daughter, his and Abigail's child, a daughter he never knew existed. The elevator dinged, and a young woman hurried toward the nurse's station. Avery, her face tight with worry. Thomas stepped back, observing from a distance as she spoke urgently with the staff. A nurse pointed toward Geraldine's room, and as Avery turned, she noticed Thomas. Recognition flickered across her face. The strange man from the park. "You," she said, approaching cautiously. "What are you doing here?" "I was visiting Mrs. Miller when she had her stroke," Thomas replied, keeping his voice calm despite his racing heart. "We're old acquaintances. I used to be her employer." Avery's expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. "You're Thomas Caldwell." "Yes. Your security person came to my flower cart yesterday." "Talking about some corporate event?" Thomas frowned. "I didn't send anyone." Their eyes locked, and Thomas could almost see the pieces clicking together in Avery's mind. She had Abigail's intelligence, that same quick way of connecting dots. Then who was he? And why would someone from your company approach me the day after you came to my cart? "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that we have a lot to discuss. But right now, you should see your mother." Avery hesitated, then nodded. "The nurse said she's still unconscious. I'll wait, if that's all right with you." As Avery disappeared into Geraldine's room, Thomas noticed a figure at the end of the hallway. Logan Peterson, his sister's head of security, ostensibly studying a hospital directory. Their eyes met briefly before Logan turned and walked away. Thomas pulled out his phone and dialed Jack. "I need continuous security on Geraldine Miller's hospital room, starting immediately, and I want protection for Avery Miller as well." "You think they're in danger?" "I know they are." "Logan Peterson is here. Margaret knows something." Geraldine lay still as death, tubes and wires connecting her frail body to softly beeping machines. Avery sat beside the bed, holding her adoptive mother's papery hand. "Mama, it's me," she whispered. "I'm here now." The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was her only answer. Avery fought back tears. Geraldine had always been her rock, her only family. The thought of losing her was unbearable. "Miss Miller," a nurse appeared at the door. "The doctor would like to speak with you about your mother's condition." In the hallway, a gray-haired physician with kind eyes introduced himself as Dr. Patel. "Your mother has suffered an ischemic stroke. We've administered treatment to break up the clot, but given her age and pre-existing conditions, we're monitoring her closely." "Will she?" Avery swallowed hard. "Will she recover?" "It's too early to tell the extent of the damage. She may experience difficulty speaking or partial paralysis. The next 24 hours are critical." After the doctor left, Avery found Thomas Caldwell still waiting, his face drawn with concern. "How is she?" he asked. "Stable but unconscious." Avery studied him. "You said you were her employer. She worked for your family." Thomas nodded. "For over 20 years. She practically raised me after my mother became busy with social obligations. She never mentioned working for the Caldwells." Avery frowned. "She told me she was a housekeeper for a family in Connecticut before moving to Savannah." "May I buy you a coffee?" Thomas gestured toward the hospital cafe. "I think there are things about Geraldine, and yourself, that you should know." In a booth at the back of the nearly empty hospital cafe, Thomas carefully measured his words. "Geraldine left our employment 25 years ago. Very suddenly. It was a difficult time for our family. My wife had just disappeared under mysterious circumstances." Avery's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Disappeared." Abigail vanished from a hotel in Malibu, left only a cryptic note saying she couldn't continue and needed to protect what we loved most. Thomas paused. 2 weeks later, Geraldine resigned and left New York. "I don't understand what this has to do with me." Thomas looked into eyes so similar to Abigail's, it made his chest ache. "I believe Geraldine left to help my wife, and I believe you are Abigail's daughter." The color drained from Avery's face. "That's impossible. My birth mother died in childbirth. That's what Geraldine always told me." "Did she ever show you a death certificate, any proof?" Avery's silence was answer enough. "There's more," Thomas continued gently. "The song you were humming in the park, Alma Perdida, was composed by Abigail. She played it only for me, never recorded it, or shared it with anyone else. Geraldine gave me the sheet music, Avery whispered. Said it was my inheritance from my mother. She looked up suddenly. If what you're saying is true, are you suggesting you might be my father? Before Thomas could answer, he caught sight of Logan Peterson entering the cafe. He kept his expression neutral while sliding his business card across the table. I think we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. My car is in the parking garage. Would you allow me to drive you home? Avery hesitated, studying Thomas's face. Something there, earnestness perhaps, or the shadow of familiar features, made her nod slowly. Let me check on Geraldine first. From across the cafe, Logan observed their conversation while pretending to scroll through his phone. When they rose to leave, he sent a quick text. Target leaving with TC, following. In her office, Margaret read the message with growing alarm. The DNA test, Thomas meeting with Avery, Geraldine's stroke. Events were moving too quickly, spiraling beyond her control. She opened her desk drawer and removed a small, leather-bound journal, Abigail's diary, which she'd taken from her sister-in-law's belongings after staging her disappearance. The pages that would have incriminated Margaret had been carefully removed and destroyed, but she'd kept the rest as insurance. Now it might prove useful in another way. Margaret dialed Logan's number. Don't let them get too close. It's time to implement contingency measures. Which ones? His voice was carefully neutral. All of them. And Logan, remember what's at stake here. For both of us. As she hung up, Margaret turned to the New York skyline, to the empire she'd helped build on a foundation of buried secrets. In 2 weeks, Caldwell Enterprises would celebrate its 25th anniversary, a quarter-century of unparalleled success following the tragic disappearance of Thomas's unstable young wife and the convenient death of her parents in what the world believed was an accident. She wouldn't let a flower seller and an old woman's stroke destroy everything she'd built. Thomas's driver maintained a respectful silence as the town car navigated through Manhattan traffic. In the back seat, Avery sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, stealing occasional glances at the man beside her, the man who might be her father. I arranged for private nurses to stay with Geraldine, Thomas said, breaking the silence. She'll have round-the-clock care. Why would you do that for someone you haven't seen in 25 years? Because she was kind to me during a difficult childhood. And because, he hesitated, if what I suspect is true, she's protected my daughter her entire life. The word daughter hung in the air between them. I've authorized a DNA test, Thomas continued. With your permission, of course. Avery's laugh held no humor. You already have my DNA, don't you? That's why you bought flowers from me, the paper I touched, maybe a hair caught in the wrapping. Thomas looked impressed. You have your mother's perception. Which mother? The question came out sharper than Avery intended. The car pulled up outside a brick townhouse on the Upper East Side, not Avery's apartment. This is my home, Thomas explained. I thought we might talk somewhere private. Your apartment might be watched. By whom? The same people who sent a security officer to your flower cart. Inside, the townhouse was elegant, but surprisingly understated. No ostentatious displays of wealth, just quality furnishings and original artwork. Thomas led her to a study lined with books. Would you like something to drink? Coffee? Something stronger? Just answers, Avery replied. Thomas nodded and pressed a button on his desk phone. Rebecca, bring the package from my safe. Please. While they waited, Avery studied a framed photograph on the desk. A young Thomas with a beautiful dark-haired woman at a piano. Is this her, Abigail? Thomas's expression softened. Yes, that was taken about a month before she disappeared. In this very room, actually. The piano is still here. He gestured to a baby grand in the corner of the study, its polished surface gleaming in the soft light. A knock at the door announced Thomas's assistant, who handed him a sealed envelope before discreetly withdrawing. Thomas opened it and removed a file. These are the adoption papers, Jack. My investigator. Found. Your birth certificate lists your mother as Jane Doe, who allegedly died in childbirth at Savannah Memorial Hospital. Except there's no record of any Jane Doe dying in childbirth at that hospital, or any hospital in Georgia, during that period. Avery felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. That doesn't prove anything. No, Thomas agreed. But this might. He opened the file further and showed her a photocopy of an employee record. Geraldine Miller, employed by the Caldwell family from 1978 to 1999, she left exactly 2 weeks after Abigail disappeared. Coincidence. And this, Thomas handed her a sheet of music, the original score of Alma Perdita in elegant handwriting. Compare it to your copy. Avery's hands trembled as she recognized the identical notation to the framed sheet music in her apartment. She could have copied it. Abigail never shared this with anyone but me. She played it only in private. Thomas leaned forward. Avery, you have her birthmark. You hum her song. You were born exactly when a child conceived before her disappearance would have been born. Avery stood abruptly, pacing the room. If what you're saying is true, if Abigail was my birth mother and she was your wife, why did she leave you? Why did Geraldine never tell me? Before Thomas could answer, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It's the hospital, excuse me, as Thomas stepped out to take the call, too. Avery was drawn to the piano. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, feeling an inexplicable connection to the instrument. Without thinking, she began to play Alma Perdita, the melody flowing from her fingers as naturally as breathing. She didn't notice Thomas return until the final notes faded. You play exactly like her, he said softly. That was her piano. Avery withdrew her hands as if burned. What did the hospital say? Geraldine is awake. She's asking for you. Thomas hesitated. And she left something for you with her nurse. They're sending it over by courier. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Thomas's assistant appeared moments later with a weathered package wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. It's addressed to you, Thomas said, handing it to Avery. Avery broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope with "For Avery, when it's time," written in Geraldine's flowing script. She always told me there would come a day when I'd need to know everything, Avery whispered. I guess she decided that day is today. She opened the envelope first and unfolded a letter written in the same careful hand. My dearest Avery, if you're reading this, it means I can no longer protect you as I promised your mother I would. It means Thomas Caldwell has found you, as we always feared he might. Not because he is a danger to you, never that, but because those who forced your mother to flee might still be watching. The journal enclosed belonged to your mother, Abigail Caldwell. She was not a runaway wife as the world was led to believe. She was a brave young woman who discovered dangerous secrets and fled to protect the child she carried. You, Abigail, died bringing you into this world, her final act of love. With her last breath, she made me promise 3 things: to raise you with all the love she would have given, to keep you safe from those who had threatened you both, and to teach you her song, Alma Perdita, which contains the key to proving what really happened. Trust Thomas. Despite what Abigail was forced to let him believe, she loved him until the end. The truth is in her journal and in the song she wrote for him. All my love. Geraldine Avery looked up, her vision blurred with tears. She says my mother, Abigail, fled to protect me, that she died giving birth to me. Thomas's face reflected her own pain. May I see the journal? Hands shaking, Avery passed him the worn leather book. Thomas opened it reverently, recognizing Abigail's handwriting immediately. He flipped through the pages. Scanning dates. These entries stop about a month before she disappeared, he noted. The last pages have been torn out, but Avery wasn't listening. She had returned to the piano and was studying the sheet music for Alma Perdita with new intensity. Geraldine said the song contains a key to proving what happened, she murmured. I always thought it was just a beautiful melody, but maybe there's something more. She began playing again, more deliberately this time, studying each note, each marking. Halfway through, she stopped suddenly. These notations aren't standard, she said, pointing to small symbols above certain notes. They're not musical directions. Thomas looked over her shoulder. Letters, he realized. The symbols correspond to letters. Together, they worked out the sequence, writing down each letter indicated by the special notations. Librarypiano, Avery read. Library piano. Thomas's eyes widened. The Caldwell estate. My family's main residence. There's a grand piano in the library. It was Abigail's favorite place to play. You think she hid something there? It's worth checking. Thomas reached for his phone. We can go first thing tomorrow." "No," Avery said firmly, clutching Abigail's journal. "We go now, tonight." As Thomas arranged for a car, neither of them noticed the small red dot of a laser sight that briefly appeared on the study window, then disappeared. Outside, in an unmarked van parked across the street, Logan lowered his equipment and made a call. They found something. "They're heading to the Caldwell estate." Margaret's voice was cold and precise. "Intercept them. Whatever Abigail hid, I want it destroyed." The rain started as Thomas's car pulled away from the Upper East Side townhouse. Fat drops pelted the windows, turning the city lights into blurred constellations. In the back seat, Avery clutched Abigail's journal like a talisman, reading entry after entry by the glow of her phone. "She loved you so much," Avery said softly. "These pages are full of you, your kindness, your dreams for the future. She writes about the melody she was composing for you." Thomas kept his eyes on the passing streetscape, afraid that if he looked at Avery, the emotions threatening to overwhelm him would break through. "She doesn't mention being pregnant," Avery continued, flipping pages. The last complete entry is dated April 15th, 1999, about 3 weeks before she disappeared. "What does it say?" Avery read aloud. "Found troubling documents in M's office today. Must investigate further before telling T. If true, everything changes. Must protect what matters most." "M," Thomas repeated. "Margaret. Your sister." Thomas nodded, his expression hardening. "She and Abigail never got along. Margaret thought Abigail was after the family fortune. Despite the fact that I'd already inherited everything when our parents died." The car swung onto the Henry Hudson Parkway, heading north out of the city. Outside, the rain intensified. "How far is this estate?" Avery asked. "About an hour north of the city, in Westchester County. It's been in the Caldwell family for generations." Thomas glanced at her. "Are you sure you want to do this tonight? We could wait until morning." Avery shook her head. "Geraldine always told me to trust my instincts right now. They're screaming that we need to hurry." Thomas studied her profile, so similar to Abigail's yet uniquely her own. He'd missed everything. Her first steps, first words, every birthday. An ache of loss pressed against his chest. "I've ordered extra security for Geraldine," he said. "No one will get to her. I should be with her. The best thing you can do for her now is find whatever Abigail hid. That's what Geraldine's been protecting all these years." As the car sped through the rainy night, neither noticed the black SUV that had pulled onto the parkway behind them, keeping a careful distance. In her penthouse office, Margaret paced like a caged tiger while Logan's voice came through the speakerphone. "I've got 2 men on their tail. They're heading to the estate, just as we suspected. And the DNA test, already handled. The lab technician has been paid to delay the results until after the gala." Margaret paused at the window, watching lightning split the Manhattan sky. "What about the old woman? Will she talk?" "She's had another stroke. Doctors have induced a coma to reduce brain swelling, even if she wakes up. Her communication may be permanently impaired. Make sure we have someone at the hospital at all times." Margaret resumed pacing. "As for Thomas and the girl, I want to know exactly what they find. No intervention unless absolutely necessary. And if they find the documents." Margaret's reflection in the rain-streaked window showed a cold smile. "Then we move to Plan B. The board meeting tomorrow will be very interesting." After ending the call, Margaret activated a secure line on her second phone. "It's me," she said. When the call connected, "We may need to accelerate our timeline, prepare the overseas accounts, and make sure the jet is ready." 25 years of meticulous planning, of building her power base within Caldwell Enterprises, of waiting for the perfect moment to take complete control, all potentially undone by a flower seller and an old woman's secrets. But Margaret Blake hadn't survived this long by being unprepared. The Caldwell estate loomed through the rain like something from another era, a sprawling stone mansion set back from a circular drive, illuminated by tasteful ground lighting, despite the late hour and the storm. A staff member waited with an umbrella as Thomas's car pulled up. "Welcome home, Mr. Caldwell," the elderly man said, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Avery. "We weren't expecting you tonight. It's a spur-of-the-moment visit." "Jeffries, is the library accessible?" "Of course, sir. Everything is maintained as you specified." Inside, The grand foyer rose 2 stories, dominated by a sweeping staircase. The air held the faint scent of furniture polish and history. Avery stood transfixed, taking in the ancestral portraits, the antique furnishings, the unmistakable atmosphere of old money and power. "This way," Thomas said, leading her down a corridor lit by wall sconces. The library was exactly as it had been 25 years ago. 2 stories of leather-bound books, comfortable reading chairs, and tall windows that would have overlooked the gardens in daylight. In the center of the room stood a magnificent Steinway grand piano, its black surface gleaming in the soft lighting. "This was Abigail's sanctuary," Thomas said, his voice hushed with memory. "She would play for hours here." Avery approached the piano reverently, running her fingers along its edge. "If she hid something, where would it be?" Thomas circled the instrument, examining it carefully. Most pianos have a compartment in the bench for storing sheet music, but that would be too obvious. Avery lifted the piano lid, propping it open to examine the interior. The song mentioned the piano specifically. "The answer has to be here." Together, they inspected every inch of the instrument. Under the keyboard cover, inside the bench, beneath the pedals, nothing. "Wait," Avery said suddenly, studying the sheet music for Alma Perdita again. "There's something else here." These circled notes form a pattern. She sat at the piano and played the circled notes in sequence, creating a simple 5-note phrase. Then she played it again, more firmly. A soft click came from within the piano's body. Thomas knelt and examined the base of the instrument, where a small panel had popped open. Inside was a sealed manila envelope. "She built a secret compartment triggered by the correct musical sequence," he whispered in awe. "Brilliant." With trembling hands, he withdrew the envelope and opened it. Inside were several documents, financial statements showing systematic embezzlement from Caldwell Enterprises to offshore accounts, photographs of Margaret meeting with known criminals, and most damning, a detailed confession signed by Logan Peterson, admitting his role in sabotaging the private plane that had killed Thomas's parents. "Your parents' death wasn't an accident," Avery said, reading over Thomas's shoulder. "Your sister had them killed." Thomas's face had gone ashen, and Abigail discovered it. That's why she ran. Margaret must have threatened her when she found out what Abigail knew. A voice from the library doorway froze them both. "Very good, little brother. Always the quick one." Margaret stood in the entrance, immaculately dressed despite the late hour, a pistol held casually in her gloved hand. Behind her loomed Logan Peterson. "I must say, I'd hoped Abigail's little time capsule would remain undiscovered," Margaret continued, stepping into the room. "But perhaps it's fitting that everything comes to light on the eve of our 25th anniversary. You killed our parents," Thomas said, rising slowly to his feet, keeping himself between Margaret and Avery. "You drove Abigail away. All for what, control of the company?" Margaret laughed, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "The company was just the beginning. With you as the grieving widower, focused on finding your runaway wife, I could build an empire, and I have." Her gaze shifted to Avery. "You look so much like her. It's really quite remarkable." "Why didn't you just kill me too?" Thomas asked. "Oh, I considered it," Margaret admitted, "but a grieving son taking over the family business after tragedy, so much more sympathetic than an ambitious daughter. Besides, I needed your golden boy reputation. It opened doors that would have remained closed to me alone." She gestured with the gun. "Now, hand over the documents. All of them. So you can destroy the evidence. I don't think so." Thomas stood his ground. "It's over, Margaret. I have copies of Abigail's journal. The DNA test will prove Avery is my daughter. Tests can be altered. Journals can be forged." Margaret's smile was cold. "The board meets tomorrow to finalize the anniversary gala preparations. I think they'll be very concerned about your mental health, Thomas. Your growing obsession with a young flower seller. Your wild accusations about your devoted sister. After all, grief can drive people to delusions, especially after 25 years of guilt." As she stepped forward, Avery suddenly struck a discordant chord on the piano, a jarring, attention-grabbing noise. In that split-second distraction, Thomas lunged, knocking the gun from Margaret's hand. Logan moved with unexpected speed, not to assist Margaret, but to grab Avery, pulling her toward the door. "Run!" he hissed in her ear. "She'll kill you both." Avery clutched the documents and Abigail's journal as Logan shoved her into the corridor. Behind them, the sounds of struggle echoed from the library. "Why are you helping me?" Avery demanded as Logan pushed her toward a side exit. "Because I'm tired of the blood on my hands." His face was grim in the dim light. "And because your mother made me promise before the end that if I ever had a chance to make things right, I would take it." "You knew my mother," Avery gasped as Logan pulled her through the darkened corridor, rain lashing against the windows of the Caldwell estate. "Later," Logan hissed, glancing over his shoulder. "Margaret has more security on the grounds. We need to get you somewhere safe." A crash echoed from the library. Logan cursed under his breath and quickened their pace, leading Avery through a maze of hallways until they reached a small door half hidden behind a tapestry. "Servant's passage," he explained. Yanking it open, "leads to the garage." The narrow staircase spiraled downward, lit only by emergency exit signs casting an eerie red glow. Avery clutched Abigail's journal and the evidence against her chest as they descended. "What about Thomas?" she asked, breathless. "He can handle himself. It's you Margaret wants eliminated." They emerged into a cavernous garage, housing a collection of luxury vehicles. Logan moved to a nondescript sedan rather than one of the showpieces. "Staff car," he explained, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. "Less conspicuous." As they slid into the vehicle, Avery suddenly grabbed Logan's arm. "Wait. You said my mother made you promise. You were there when she died." Logan's face was partially shadowed, but Avery could see the muscle in his jaw tighten. "Yes. Tell me what happened to her." "Not now. We need to." "No." Avery's voice was steel. "I've lived 24 years with lies. I'm not taking another step until I know the truth." Rain drummed on the car roof as Logan stared straight ahead, hands gripping the wheel. "I was Margaret's security chief and more," he began. "When Abigail discovered the documents implicating Margaret in your grandparents' deaths, Margaret ordered me to handle the situation. I followed Abigail to her doctor's appointment, where I overheard that she was pregnant." Logan started the car, easing toward the garage exit as he continued. "I reported back to Margaret, who decided that a pregnant Abigail was an even greater threat. She planned to stage an accident, make it look like suicide driven by postpartum depression." The car emerged onto a rain-slicked service road that wound around the estate grounds. But Geraldine discovered the plan and warned Abigail. They fled together. I tracked them to Savannah. But by then, he paused. By then, I'd begun to question everything. Years of doing Margaret's dirty work, the deaths I'd caused or facilitated. When I found Abigail, she was 8 months pregnant and terrified. "So you let her go?" Avery asked. "No." Logan's voice dropped. "I confronted her, told her she needed to disappear permanently, change her identity. She went into labor during our conversation. Stress. The doctor later said there were complications. Before she died, she made me promise that if I ever had the chance to make amends, to protect her child, I would take it." He turned to meet Avery's gaze briefly. "I've been waiting 24 years to keep that promise." The rain began to ease as they drove away from the estate, the mansion's lights receding in the rearview mirror. "Why help Margaret all these years if you felt guilty? She had evidence of my involvement in your grandparents' deaths. And more recently, she's been threatening someone else, someone I can't allow her to hurt." Avery's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "It's Thomas," Margaret subdued. "Meeting you at the place we discussed. Bring everything." She showed Logan the message. His expression darkened. "Thomas doesn't have your number." "Does he?" Avery shook her head. "It's a trap. Margaret's people are tracking your phone." Logan pulled over abruptly, took Avery's phone, and tossed it out the window into a roadside ditch. "We need to disappear until the board meeting." "What board meeting?" "Tomorrow at 9 a.m., the Caldwell Enterprises board meets to finalize the anniversary gala plans. If we can present the evidence there, with Thomas backing us up, it ends Margaret's reign immediately. And if we can't," Logan's expression was grim, "then Margaret declares Thomas mentally unstable, takes complete control of the company, and you and I disappear permanently." Thomas Caldwell pressed a handkerchief to his bleeding lip as Jeffries, the elderly butler, helped him to his feet. "Sir, shall I call the police?" "No." Thomas shook his head. wincing at the stab of pain. "Where's my sister?" "Ms. Blake left in great haste, sir, and the young lady departed with Mr. Peterson." Thomas's heart sank. Had Logan taken Avery to Margaret, or was something else happening? "Bring me my phone, Jeffries, and have security sweep the grounds." In his pocket, Thomas found the note Logan had slipped him during the brief scuffle, taking her to safety. "Trust no one. Board meeting tomorrow. Bring DNA results." As Jeffries returned with his phone, Thomas dialed Jack Blackwood. "Jack, I need an expedited DNA test. Emergency priority." "Already working on it," the investigator replied. "The lab owes me a favor, should have preliminary results by morning. Have them sent directly to my phone, and Jack, find out everything you can about Margaret's activities in the last 24 hours. Financial movements, travel arrangements, everything." After ending the call, Thomas returned to the library and sat at Abigail's piano. His fingers brushed the keys gently, finding the melody of Alma Perdida without conscious thought. 25 years of believing Abigail had abandoned him, had chosen to leave without explanation. Now he knew she'd fled to protect their unborn child, had died bringing their daughter into the world. The pain was almost unbearable, yet beneath it lay a fierce determination. He would not fail Abigail again. He would not lose their daughter. Thomas opened the piano lid and examined the interior mechanism more carefully, looking for any other hidden compartments Abigail might have created. The 5-note sequence that had revealed the documents. It was elegant, but somehow felt incomplete. He took out the sheet music for Alma Perdida and spread it on the piano rack, studying it with fresh eyes. The circled notes that formed the unlocking sequence were obvious now. But there were other markings, small dashes under certain notes, patterns that seemed deliberate. Thomas played these marked notes in sequence, listening intently. Another click came from inside the piano, this time from the opposite side. A second hidden compartment contained a small thumb drive labeled simply Plan B. Thomas slipped it into his pocket just as his phone rang. "Thomas, it's Rebecca. The hospital called. Geraldine Miller is awake and asking for you." Avery and Logan had switched vehicles twice before arriving at a modest cabin in the Catskills, a property Logan claimed wasn't connected to either himself or the Caldwells. "Burner phones," he said, handing Avery a basic flip phone. "Mine's programmed as number 1 on speed dial. Use it only if absolutely necessary." Avery sat at a rough wooden table, spreading out the documents they'd recovered from the piano, while Logan secured the perimeter of the cabin. "These bank statements show systematic embezzlement," she said when he returned. "And these photos, Margaret meeting with known criminals. Evidence that would put her away for decades." Logan agreed. "But only if we can present it to the right people. Margaret has law enforcement contacts who would happily make evidence disappear. That's why we need the board meeting," Avery realized. "Public exposure where she can't control the situation." She picked up Abigail's journal again, flipping through the pages she'd now read multiple times. "There's something we're missing. Geraldine's letter said Alma Perdida contains the key to proving what really happened. We found the documents, but they don't explain everything." Avery moved to a dust-covered upright piano in the corner of the cabin's main room. Her fingers found the keys of Alma Perdida, playing the melody that had been part of her life for as long as she could remember. The 5-note sequence unlocked the compartment, she mused. But what about these other markings? The dashes under certain notes. She played just the notes with dashes beneath them, creating a different pattern. When nothing happened, she tried playing them in reverse order. "It's not another physical key," Logan suggested. "Maybe it's a code of some kind." Avery studied the sheet music again, noticing how the marked notes related to the standard musical scale. "Letters," she whispered. "If A is the first letter, B is the second, and so on." Working rapidly, she transcribed the sequence of marked notes into letters. When finished, she stared at the result. "MBJP5591, she read aloud. "It looks like an account number," Logan finished. "JP Morgan, offshore account, number 5591. How would we access it?" "We don't need to," Logan replied. "Just proving it exists would corroborate the embezzlement claims. And if this is what I think it is, it's the account Margaret used to funnel money after your grandparents' deaths." Avery traced her finger over the handwritten music, marveling at Abigail's ingenuity. She hid everything in plain sight, in a melody so personal that only Thomas would recognize its importance. "Your mother was remarkable," Logan said quietly. She knew she might not survive to tell her story, so she left breadcrumbs for those who would listen closely enough. As the night deepened around the isolated cabin, Avery continued studying the journal and sheet music, searching for any other hidden messages Abigail might have left behind. In less than 12 hours, they would face Margaret at the board meeting, a confrontation 25 years in the making. She only hoped Thomas would be there to finally hear the complete melody Abigail had composed for him, a song of love, warning, and ultimately, justice. The hospital corridor was eerily quiet at 3 a.m. Thomas nodded to the private security guard he'd stationed outside Geraldine's room before quietly entering. The elderly woman looked frail against the white sheets, tubes, and monitors surrounding her bed, but her eyes were open and alert. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You found her." He took Geraldine's thin hand in his. "Yes, I found Avery." Tears welled in Geraldine's eyes. "She's so like her mother, so strong." "Why, Geraldine?" The question that had haunted him for 25 years finally escaped. "Why didn't you tell me Abigail was pregnant? Why let me believe she abandoned me?" Geraldine's fingers tightened weakly around his. "She made me promise. Said it was the only way to keep the baby safe." Her breathing grew labored. "Margaret had evidence of what Logan did to your parents. Threatened to kill Abigail and the child if she went to you or the police." Thomas leaned closer. What exactly did Abigail discover? Financial records. Margaret had been embezzling for years. Your parents suspected something. That's why she arranged their accident. Geraldine paused, gathering strength. When Abigail found proof, Margaret caught her, gave her a choice: disappear forever or watch you die too. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of betrayal more complete than Thomas had imagined. "You helped her escape." Geraldine nodded. "To my cousin's place in Savannah. But the stress, complications during birth," her voice broke. "Abigail's last words were for you, said to tell you she never stopped loving you, that everything she did was to protect what you both loved most." Thomas fought back tears. "Your disappearance right after hers. Margaret must have suspected. She knew I helped Abigail, made a deal. My silence about what she'd done in exchange for leaving Avery and me alone." Geraldine's eyes flashed with unexpected fire. "I've regretted that bargain every day since. Should have fought harder. You protected my daughter for 24 years. Thomas said gently. "I can never repay that debt." Geraldine's gaze grew distant. "The music. Did you solve it?" Abigail encoded everything. "We found the documents in the piano, and Avery discovered an account number hidden in the notation." "Not everything," Geraldine whispered. "There's more, hidden in plain sight." Her eyes drifted closed, fatigue overtaking her. Thomas waited, but Geraldine had fallen back asleep, the monitors showing her vital signs stable but weak. He brushed a strand of white hair from her forehead, then quietly left the room. In the corridor, his phone vibrated. An email from Jack Blackwood contained 2 attachments: the preliminary DNA results and a comprehensive report on Margaret's recent activities. The DNA results confirmed what he already knew in his heart. Avery was his daughter, a 99,998% match. The second document showed Margaret had been busy. Large funds transferred to offshore accounts, a private jet scheduled for tomorrow evening with a flight plan to a non-extradition country, and communications with board members scheduling individual meetings before the full board gathering. She was preparing her exit strategy while simultaneously shoring up support for her final move against him. As Thomas headed for the elevator, his phone rang again. An unknown number. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Dr. Shaw from the lab, about those DNA results. I just received them. Thank you for the expedited processing." "Sir, that's why I'm calling. We haven't released the results yet. We're still processing the samples." Thomas stopped walking. "Then what did I just receive?" "I can't say, sir, but they didn't come from us. We won't have official results until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest." After ending the call, Thomas stared at the email from Jack again. The formatting looked right. The language sounded like Jack. But the sender address had subtle differences from Jack's actual email. Differences he'd missed in his exhaustion. Margaret was one step ahead, feeding him false information, likely tracking his movements through the doctored file he'd opened. Thomas deleted the email and removed the battery from his phone. Whatever game Margaret was playing, he wouldn't make it easy for her. As dawn broke over the Catskills, Avery stood on the cabin's small porch, clutching a mug of coffee against the morning chill. She'd spent most of the night studying Abigail's journal and the sheet music. Searching for any other hidden messages, Logan emerged from the cabin, his own coffee in hand. Sleep at all? Avery shook her head. Too much to process. We should leave soon. The board meeting is at 9. Logan, Avery said carefully, you mentioned Margaret was threatening someone else. Someone you needed to protect. Who? He stared into his coffee. My daughter. She doesn't know about me. Her mother and I. It was complicated. Margaret discovered her existence last year. That's why you've stayed loyal all these years. Loyalty had nothing to do with it. Logan replied bitterly. Fear, guilt, self-preservation, yes, but never loyalty. Avery studied him. You were Abigail's friend, weren't you, before all this? A flicker of surprise crossed Logan's face. How did you know? There's a photo in the journal, partially torn, but it shows 3 people on a boat. Thomas, Abigail, and another man whose face is mostly missing. But the handwriting on the back says, Summer with T and L. Logan's expression softened with memory. Cape Cod, summer of '98, before Margaret got her hooks into me completely. He looked away. I was Thomas's friend first, actually. College roommates. Introduced him to Abigail at a charity concert. And then betrayed them both. Yes. The simple admission hung in the morning air. Avery turned to face him fully. I need to know I can trust you today. Not just for my sake, but for Thomas's. You can't, Logan said bluntly. Not completely. I've done unforgivable things. But today, our interests align perfectly, bringing down Margaret before she destroys more lives. Inside the cabin, the burner phone rang. Logan answered, his expression growing more intense as he listened. It's Thomas, he said, handing Avery the phone. He's been to see Geraldine. Avery. Thomas's voice sounded tired but determined. Where are you? Safe. Logan has a cabin. Don't tell me. Thomas interrupted. Margaret's monitoring communications. I've been getting false information. Doctored DNA results. She's setting something up. Avery's heart raced. We're planning to come to the board meeting. We have the documents, plus an offshore account number Abigail hid in the sheet music. Good, but be careful. Geraldine said there's more hidden in plain sight that we haven't found yet. In the music. She didn't specify, just that it was hidden in plain sight. A pause. Avery, the real DNA results won't be ready until this afternoon, but I don't need them to know you're my daughter. Emotion caught in Avery's throat. I'll see you at the meeting. After hanging up, Avery returned to Abigail's journal, flipping through it with renewed purpose. Hidden in plain sight, she murmured. Her attention caught on one of the earliest entries, where Abigail described Thomas showing her the Caldwell estate for the first time. The painting in the library haunts me. The family portrait with those cold eyes watching everything. Avery looked up at Logan. The family portrait in the library. Did Abigail ever mention it? Logan frowned. Not specifically. It's been there forever. Thomas's parents, grandparents, the whole dynasty. We need to look at that painting before the board meeting. Margaret Blake surveyed the array of screens in her private security office beneath the Caldwell Tower. One showed Thomas entering his penthouse. Another displayed the empty cabin where Logan's GPS had been stationary for hours. A third showed the boardroom being prepared for the morning meeting. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The board members had received her evidence of Thomas's deteriorating mental health, carefully selected footage of his apparent obsession with a young flower seller, his erratic behavior at the estate, his late-night hospital visit to a dementia patient. By noon, Thomas would be removed as CEO, placed on medical leave pending psychological evaluation. By evening, Margaret would be on a private jet to Dubai, her decades of financial manipulation untraceable thanks to the shell companies she'd established. As for Avery Miller, well, accidents happened all the time to people who stuck their noses where they didn't belong. Margaret checked her watch. 2 hours until the board meeting. Time to put the final pieces in place. She picked up her phone and dialed. Is everything ready at the estate? Yes. Ma'am? Came the reply. The painting has been replaced with the duplicate. No one will notice the difference. Margaret smiled coldly. Perfect. What Thomas and Avery didn't realize was that the Caldwell family portrait in the library contained more than just a record of dynasty. Hidden in the background, details was the original document establishing the Caldwell Trust, with terms that Margaret had strategically altered in all other copies. If they discovered the portrait's secret, they might unravel her final deception. But Margaret had spent 25 years covering her tracks. She wouldn't start making mistakes now. First light was breaking over the Caldwell estate as Thomas's car crunched up the gravel driveway. He'd changed into a fresh suit, his posture erect and determined despite the bruise darkening his jaw. The grand house stood silent, the staff not yet stirring in the early morning hours. Using his private key, Thomas entered through a side door and made his way to the library. He needed to examine the family portrait before the board meeting, to find whatever Geraldine had hinted was hidden in plain sight. The Caldwell family portrait dominated the library's east wall, an imposing oil painting from the 1950s showing Thomas's grandparents seated, flanked by their children, including Thomas's father as a young man. The background depicted the library itself, creating a recursive effect that had fascinated Thomas as a child. Now he studied it with new eyes, searching for anything unusual. The painting appeared exactly as he remembered it. The stern patriarch, the dutiful wife, the rigid children. Wait. Thomas stepped closer, examining the bookshelf visible in the painting's background. Among the leather-bound volumes was a distinctive red book with gold lettering, the Caldwell Trust. Founding documents. He glanced at the actual bookshelf behind him, finding the same red volume exactly where it appeared in the painting. With trembling hands, Thomas retrieved the book. Inside were the original trust documents establishing Caldwell Enterprises, including a clause he'd never seen before. In the event of suspected malfeasance by any trustee, all assets revert to the eldest male heir until an independent audit is completed. The implications staggered him. If Thomas formally accused Margaret of embezzlement, control of the entire company would automatically revert to him during the investigation. No board vote required. His phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. Estate compromised. Meet at tower before board meeting. L. Thomas replaced the book, photographed the relevant pages with his phone, and left as quietly as he had arrived. Margaret had always been meticulous, but she'd overlooked something crucial. The family trust was structured to survive precisely the kind of betrayal she had engineered. The painting's been replaced, Logan said grimly, meeting Avery and Thomas in the private elevator to the Caldwell Towers boardroom. My contact in estate security confirmed it. Margaret sent a team at 4 a.m. She knows we're onto her, Thomas replied. But she doesn't know what we found. Avery clutched her tote bag containing Abigail's journal and the documents from the piano. Will it be enough? It has to be, Thomas said. The board members are already gathering. Logan handed them each an earpiece. These are secure. We'll be able to communicate if we get separated. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor of Caldwell Tower, a monument to corporate power with its sweeping views of Manhattan. Board members in expensive suits mingled over coffee, their conversations hushing momentarily as Thomas entered with Avery and Logan. Margaret stood at the head of the massive conference table, immaculate in a charcoal suit, her composure perfect save for the brief flash of surprise at seeing the three of them together. Thomas, she recovered smoothly. We weren't expecting you to bring guests to this private board meeting. Not guests, Margaret. Witnesses. Thomas held her gaze steadily. Ms. Miller has evidence the board needs to see. Margaret's smile never wavered. How dramatic. Though I'm concerned about your state of mind. Bringing a flower seller to a corporate board meeting. She turned to the gathered executives. As I mentioned in my emails, my brother has been under tremendous strain lately. An older man, Harold Winters, the longest-serving board member, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should begin the meeting formally before addressing unusual circumstances. Excellent suggestion, Margaret agreed, gesturing for everyone to take their seats. Thomas guided Avery to a chair beside him, while Logan positioned himself near the door, scanning the room professionally. As the meeting formally opened, Margaret projected a PowerPoint presentation on the wall screen. Before we finalize the 25th anniversary gala details, I need to address a difficult subject. Photos appeared on screen. Thomas at Avery's flower cart. Thomas entering the hospital. Thomas arguing with Margaret at the estate. My brother has become fixated on a young woman he believes is connected to his late wife, Margaret continued, her voice gentle with practiced concern. His behavior has become erratic, his accusations against me increasingly paranoid. Murmurs spread around the table as more images appeared. Selective screenshots of Thomas's text messages, surveillance photos altered to make innocent interactions seem obsessive. I hate bringing this to the board, Margaret said, her eyes downcast in a perfect simulation of reluctance. But I fear Thomas is no longer capable of leading Caldwell Enterprises. I'm proposing a temporary medical leave while he receives the help he needs. That's enough, Margaret. Thomas rose, his voice calm but commanding. You've orchestrated an impressive smear campaign, but it's time for the truth. He nodded to Avery, who removed the documents from her bag and began distributing copies to each board member. 25 years ago, Thomas continued, my wife Abigail discovered evidence that Margaret had embezzled millions from the company and arranged the death of our parents to gain control. When Abigail confronted her, Margaret threatened to kill her and her unborn child. Shocked gasps echoed around the table as executives flipped through the documents. Abigail fled to protect our daughter. Thomas gestured to Avery, leaving behind evidence in case anything happened to her. Evidence we've now recovered. Margaret's laugh was brittle. This is exactly what I mean about paranoid delusions. These documents are obvious forgeries, and this absurd claim about Miss Miller being your daughter. DNA tests are being processed, Thomas interrupted. But the evidence speaks for itself. Bank statements showing systematic embezzlement to offshore accounts. Photographs of you meeting with known criminals. Logan Peterson's signed confession about his role in sabotaging our parents' plane. All eyes turned to Logan, who stepped forward. Everything in that confession is true. I've been Margaret's accomplice for years, helping her cover up her crimes in exchange for her silence about my involvement in the Caldwell deaths. Margaret's composure cracked momentarily before she rallied. Logan is clearly being coerced. These ridiculous documents prove nothing. And even if Thomas genuinely believes this fantasy, it only confirms my concerns about his mental state. Harold Winters studied the financial statements with a frown. These account numbers, they match transfers I questioned years ago. You told me they were approved real estate acquisitions. They were, Margaret insisted. Thomas is manipulating past transactions to build this absurd narrative. Thomas laid his final card on the table, displaying the trust document on the screen. The Caldwell Family Trust contains a specific clause. When a trustee is accused of malfeasance, control reverts automatically to the eldest male heir during investigation. That's why you replaced the painting at the estate, Margaret. You knew it showed the original trust book that contained this clause. For the first time, real fear flashed across Margaret's face. That document is outdated. It's the founding trust, Thomas countered. Never amended, never revoked. The boardroom doors suddenly burst open as security personnel entered, followed by 2 FBI agents. What is the meaning of this? Margaret demanded, regaining her imperious tone. Margaret Blake, one agent said, stepping forward. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzlement, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. This is absurd, Margaret's voice rose. You have no authority to interrupt a private board meeting. These so-called documents are fabrications created by my mentally unstable brother. Actually, the agent replied, we've been investigating Caldwell Enterprises for months based on financial irregularities flagged by banking algorithms. Mr. Peterson approached us yesterday with corroborating evidence and a full confession. Logan met Margaret's betrayed stare evenly. I made a promise to Abigail before she died. Today I'm finally keeping it. As the agents moved toward Margaret, she reached into her jacket. Security personnel tensed, but she merely withdrew a small remote control. How disappointingly predictable, she said, suddenly calm. Did you really think I wouldn't have contingency plans? She pressed a button on the remote. Immediately, the building's fire alarms activated, sprinklers drenching the boardroom as emergency strobe lights flashed in the ensuing chaos. Board members scrambling for exits, security shouting instructions. Margaret slipped through a private door behind the presentation screen. She's heading for the helipad, Logan shouted over the alarms. It's her evacuation plan. Thomas grabbed Avery's hand. Stay with me. They pushed through the confusion, following Logan toward the emergency stairwell that led to the roof. Behind them, FBI agents were in pursuit, but hampered by the crowds evacuating the building as they burst onto the rooftop, rain pelting their faces. The helicopter's engines were already whining to life, Margaret climbing aboard. "Stop!" Thomas shouted against the wind and rotor noise. Margaret paused in the helicopter doorway, her expression cold as she raised a gun. "You were always too trusting, little brother," she called. "Too willing to see the good in people. That was your weakness. And yours was underestimating Abigail," Thomas replied. "She outsmarted you from beyond the grave." For a moment, something like regret crossed Margaret's face. Then she fired. Not at Thomas, but at Avery. Logan moved with unexpected speed. Shoving Avery aside and taking the bullet in his shoulder, he fell to the rooftop as FBI agents stormed through the door, weapons drawn. "FBI, drop your weapon." Margaret's eyes met Thomas's one final time, not with hatred or even fear, but with a strange, empty resignation. Then she slammed the helicopter door shut as the aircraft lurched upward. They watched as the helicopter rose into the rain-lashed sky, banking sharply toward the Hudson River. No one said a word as it disappeared into the clouds. 30 seconds later, the sound of the explosion reached them, a dull, distant thud that seemed to reverberate through the steel and concrete beneath their feet. "She had it rigged!" Logan gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder as Avery pressed her jacket against the wound. "Dead man's switch. If she couldn't escape, no one would." As paramedics rushed to attend to Logan, Thomas put his arm around Avery's shoulders. Together, they watched as smoke rose in the distance. Marking the final chapter of Margaret Blake's 25-year reign of deception, the melody Abigail had composed so long ago, Alma Perdita, had finally played its last triumphant note. 1 year later, spring sunshine streamed through the windows of the Caldwell Estate Library, bathing the grand piano in golden light. Avery's fingers moved confidently across the keys, the familiar notes of Alma Perdita filling the room with haunting beauty. She had added her own flourishes to the composition over the past year, subtle variations that honored her mother's work while adding her own voice. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching his daughter play. The resemblance to Abigail in her posture, her complete absorption in the music, still took his breath away. Seeing her at the same piano where Abigail had once composed this very melody felt like the closing of a circle, a wound finally healed. "That was beautiful," he said, as the final notes faded. Avery smiled, the small crescent birthmark on her temple catching the light. "I added a coda. I think Mom would approve. She would be incredibly proud of you." Thomas crossed to join her at the piano bench. "As I am." The past year had been a whirlwind of discoveries and adjustments. The official DNA results had confirmed what they already knew in their hearts. Avery was indeed Thomas and Abigail's daughter. The media had swarmed when the story broke. The corrupt executive's dramatic death, the long-lost heiress, the decades of deception. Through it all, Thomas had protected Avery from the spotlight as much as possible, giving her time to adjust to her new reality. "Have you decided about the conservatory offer?" Thomas asked. Avery ran her fingers lightly over the keys. "I'm going to accept. Teaching music to underprivileged kids is exactly what I want to do. And with the Foundation's backing, we can expand the program nationwide." The Abigail Caldwell Foundation had been Thomas's first major initiative after reclaiming control of the company. Dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence and providing music education to disadvantaged youth, it had quickly become one of the most respected charitable organizations in the country. "The dedication ceremony is tomorrow," Thomas reminded her. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Avery replied. "Geraldine says she wouldn't miss it for the world." Geraldine Miller had made a remarkable recovery over the past year, though she still used a wheelchair, and her speech remained slightly impaired. Her mind had regained much of its sharpness. She had moved into a private suite in the Caldwell estate, where she could be close to both Thomas and Avery. "Did Logan confirm he's coming?" Avery asked. Thomas nodded. "With his daughter. It's the first time he's bringing her to a public event." Logan Peterson had survived his gunshot wound and, in exchange for his full cooperation with authorities, had received a reduced sentence for his role in the Caldwell parents' deaths. He served 6 months in a minimum security facility before being released on probation, during which time he had finally connected with his teenage daughter and begun the long process of building a relationship with her. "Is it strange?" Avery asked suddenly. "Working with him after everything." Thomas considered the question. Sometimes, but we're all products of our choices and circumstances. Logan made terrible choices, but in the end, he chose to protect you. That counts for something. The investigation into Margaret's activities had revealed decades of manipulation and criminal behavior beyond the embezzlement and the murder of Thomas's parents. Evidence emerged that she had systematically eliminated anyone who threatened her position. The full extent of her crimes might never be known, but the corrupted empire she had built within Caldwell Enterprises had been dismantled. "I had the strangest dream last night," Avery said, closing the piano lid gently. "I dreamed Mom was playing this piano, and I was sitting beside her, watching her hands. Except I wasn't me now. I was a little girl, the daughter she never got to raise." Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. "She's been with you all along, in the music, in the way Geraldine raised you, in the birthmark you share, in the talent that flows through your fingers." Avery leaned against him, accepting the embrace. Though their relationship had begun in trauma and revelation, over the past year they had carefully built a foundation of trust and understanding. The initial awkwardness had gradually given way to genuine affection and respect. "Come on," Thomas said, standing. "Geraldine's waiting for us in the garden. The roses she planted are blooming." The Garden of Remembrance sprawled across 3 acres of the Caldwell estate, transformed from formal gardens into a peaceful sanctuary of winding paths, flowering trees, and quiet reflection pools. At its center stood a bronze statue of a woman at a piano, her face turned upward in an expression of serene joy. Geraldine sat in her wheelchair near a bed of white roses, Abigail's favorites, supervising as gardeners prepared for tomorrow's dedication ceremony. Despite her physical limitations, she remained a commanding presence, directing operations with the same efficiency she had once brought to running the Caldwell household. "There you are," she called as Thomas and Avery approached. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten our lunch date. Just finishing some practice," Avery explained, bending to kiss Geraldine's cheek. "The roses are spectacular," Thomas commented, admiring the pristine white blooms. "They'd better be, considering what they cost." Geraldine sniffed, though her eyes twinkled with humor. "Nothing but the best for our Abigail." A staff member approached with a tray of refreshments, setting it on a nearby table. As they settled into comfortable garden chairs, Geraldine withdrew a small velvet box from her sweater pocket. "I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this," she said, handing it to Avery. "Tomorrow seemed appropriate, but I find I can't wait any longer." Avery opened the box to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of Abigail, smiling directly at the camera. On the opposite side was an inscription, "To my darling daughter, may your soul never be lost." She had it made when she learned she was pregnant, Geraldine explained, her voice thick with emotion. "She wanted you to have something of hers, even if she couldn't be with you." Tears spilled down Avery's cheeks as Thomas fastened the locket around her neck. "Thank you for keeping it safe all these years," she whispered to Geraldine. "I kept my promises," the older woman replied. "All 3 of them. I raised you with love. I kept you safe until the time was right. And I taught you her song." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts as the spring breeze carried the scent of roses around them. "You know," Thomas said finally, "for 25 years, I believed Alma Perdita was about loss. Only now do I understand that Abigail named it that way because she knew someday our lost souls would find each other again, miles away." In a maximum security women's prison, inmate 45721 sat alone in the visitation room. The resemblance to Margaret Blake was subtle but unmistakable. The same aristocratic features softened by age and hardship, the once perfect posture now slightly stooped. The visitor's door opened, and a guard ushered in a young man in his early 20s. Impeccably dressed, his eyes cold with calculation that belied his youth. "Hello, Mother," he said, taking the seat across from her. The woman's face betrayed no emotion. "You shouldn't have come, James. It's too dangerous. It's been a year. The Caldwells have their happy ending. No one is watching anymore." He leaned forward. "I've made contact with Logan's daughter, as you suggested. She has no idea who I really am. And the offshore accounts, the contingency files. Secured, everything is proceeding according to your instructions." James withdrew a small photograph from his pocket, a picture of Avery at a recent charity gala, standing beside Thomas. The prodigal daughter has taken her place in the Caldwell dynasty. The woman studied the photo with an unreadable expression. She looks so much like her mother. Does that bother you? A thin smile curved her lips. On the contrary, it makes what comes next all the more poetic. She handed the photo back, her prison-issue bracelet catching the fluorescent light, though the name on it read, Ellen Cooper. The woman who had once been Margaret Blake's most loyal assistant had carried her secrets and her plans forward. Patience, James, she cautioned, seeing the eager glint in the young man's eyes. The Caldwells have had their year of happiness. Let them enjoy their dedication ceremony, their foundation, their reunion. Our time will come. The way you planned it all along, James agreed, standing as the guards signaled the end of visiting hours. As he left, Ellen Cooper, the woman who had switched identities with Margaret Blake just before the helicopter flight, fingered the small locket hidden beneath her prison uniform.